This
is the African frequency,
where voices rise and truth travels.
If the story speaks to you, let it travel further. Subscribe live.
Graduation ceremonies don't usually make headlines. They come and go, uniforms pressed, photos taken, speeches made. But this one's different. In Burkina Faso, 181 new police cadets are stepping into service. Among them are recruits from neighboring Chad. And together they form a graduating class called Yantiali, a word that doesn't just mean vision in the local language. It represents direction, strategy, and something more profound. Purpose. Most people outside the region won't hear about this, but they should. This isn't just a formal ceremony. It's a moment that signals a national pivot. Under President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso is reshaping its entire security landscape, not by imitating the West, but by centering its own vision of sovereignty, unity, and resilience. And that brings us here, because something bigger is happening beneath the surface. This new generation of officers isn't being trained to maintain order. They're being prepared to defend a country choosing to walk a very different path. One defined not by external influence, but by internal will. So if you think this is just about uniforms and protocol, you might want to stay a little longer. By the end of this story, you may start to see West Africa and its leaders in a new light. If you care about stories the mainstream tends to overlook and voices the world doesn't always listen to, make sure you subscribe. There's a lot more coming. Now, what does it actually mean when a police academy calls its newest graduating class vision? Let's start there. What does it mean when vision becomes part of a police officer's job description? In Burkina Faso, the word Yantiali isn't just a poetic name for a graduating class. It's a statement about the kind of future the state wants to shape. And the choice to place that word front and center, it says everything about where the country believes it's heading. The 9th class of the National Police Academy is stepping out after 2 years of intensive training. 181 cadets, some from Burkina Faso, others from Chad, now carry the title of officer. Notably, it's the first time the Academy has leaned this hard into a regional vision. One that goes beyond borders and speaks directly to unity across the Sahel. What's changing here isn't just who's being trained, but why. In past decades, police forces across West Africa often functioned in the shadows of outdated colonial systems, bureaucratic, externally modeled, and often detached from the communities they served. They were seen as the arms of the state, but not the soul of it. Today, that equation is shifting. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, there's a growing belief that law enforcement must serve not only as protectors, but as ambassadors of a national identity that's being rebuilt from within. If a nation sees itself as rising, then its institutions, especially the ones with power and arms, need to reflect that rise in their values, not just their uniforms. And here's where it gets interesting. The training at the academy is no longer focused purely on discipline, procedures, or field tactics. Now it's infused with ideology, an effort to align every cadet with a national sense of mission. That's a bold move and maybe even a risky one. Because what happens when ideology becomes part of standard police curriculum? Some might argue it strengthens cohesion, makes the force more unified, more purpose-driven. Others might warn that too much vision without checks can blur the line between civil service and political allegiance. But here's the human side of it. Cadets interviewed on the ground say they feel empowered in ways they didn't expect. "Before this, I thought I was just joining a force," one recruit said. "Now I feel like I'm joining a cause." That's powerful, but it also comes with weight. When someone believes they're fighting for something bigger than rules, mistakes can have meaning that cuts deeper. We think this may be part of a broader trend across parts of Africa. Governments reshaping security forces not as extensions of colonial architecture, but as forward-facing institutions grounded in sovereignty. And if that's the case, we have to ask, what gets lost when the narrative shifts from neutral enforcement to value-driven defense? What happens to objectivity, to public trust, but also what gets gained? Could these new values become the very thing that builds a deeper connection between officer and citizen? The cadets of Yantiali are walking into that question, and they won't be the last. The real test, of course, will be whether this vision can hold when boots hit the ground and theory meets reality. But before we get there, we need to understand what exactly these cadets are being taught and who they're expected to become. You can train a cadet in tactics, but how do you train someone to carry a national identity? Inside the police academy, something unusual is happening. The curriculum still includes standard law enforcement modules, crowd control, forensics, communication protocols. But layered into that now is something more ideological, more intentional. Cadets are being immersed in themes of sovereignty, dignity, and regional solidarity. They're learning history, not colonial timelines, but stories of African resistance. They're reading less about foreign case studies and more about what happens when a nation chooses to stand on its own feet. And that shift, it's not just educational, it's emotional. For many of these young officers, this is the first time they've been told that their role isn't just about protecting people, it's about protecting meaning. Before, they were taught how to follow law. Now they're being asked to defend a worldview. We think this changes the way a person walks in uniform. When someone believes they're part of something bigger than themselves, they often carry that authority differently. More pride, maybe, but maybe also more risk of absolutism. What does that mean on the street? What happens when a cadet trained in pride and sovereignty is faced with dissent? Do they see a protester or a threat to the vision they've been told to protect? That tension is worth watching, not to criticize, but to understand. One cadet, speaking anonymously, said this: "I used to think being a cop meant controlling situations. Now I see it as defending values. That's heavier." It's a profound shift and not without cost. There are advantages, yes, stronger cohesion, a sense of purpose, pride in the badge. But there are trade-offs too: increased emotional stakes, less room for gray areas, more pressure to align with national narratives. If people are shaped by what they're told they're protecting, then we have to ask, what stories are these cadets being given? And who's writing them? This matters, especially as Burkina Faso positions itself differently on the world stage. Its alliances are changing, its tone is shifting, and its institutions like this academy are being redesigned to match. That's why we're watching this class so closely. Because in many ways, how they've been taught may predict how they will lead. If you're finding this shift as fascinating and complex as we are, this is the kind of story we follow often. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And to truly understand where this new generation is headed, we need to look beyond the classroom and into the numbers. Success rates are just numbers until you ask what they really measure. The Academy proudly announced a 96.3% pass rate for police commissioners and 86.4% for officers. On paper, that's a win. It signals structure, discipline, a system that's working. But what do those numbers actually tell us about the kind of officer being shaped here? Among the 181 cadets who began the cycle, several were expelled during the program: 3 commissioners, 1 officer, due to indiscipline or failure to meet academic standards. That matters not because of the removals themselves, but because of what's now being prioritized. Before, passing simply meant surviving the curriculum. Now it means aligning with a standard that is as moral as it is procedural. Cadets are no longer just expected to learn, they're expected to transform. And that transformation comes with pressure. Because when success means living up to ideals like loyalty, sacrifice, and vision, the margin for error shrinks. We think that's where the tension lies. If people could truly be molded by narrative alone, these standards might create a near-perfect core. But people are people. They bring fear, fatigue, doubt, and sometimes defiance. So what happens when those human moments clash with rigid ideals? That's what makes this more than a graduation. It's a filter, a system designed to test not just knowledge or physical endurance, but alignment. The cadets who made it through were not only smart, they were seen as fit to embody what the institution now represents. One of them, Commissioner Major Nana Olivier, graduated with a score above 16 out of 20, marked very good. Another, Officer Major Faubio Bruno, closed with a 15, six strong numbers, sure. But even stronger was the way these names were delivered during the ceremony, with applause not just for grades but for character. Before, top students were seen as future leaders. Now they're being positioned as symbols. There's something admirable in that and something risky too, because when people become symbols, failure becomes public, and success stops being personal. We wonder if institutions push for heroes, do they leave room for humans? What's gained when you celebrate excellence so loudly? And what might be lost? The answer may lie in how these officers are deployed. But before that, it's worth asking, what kind of pressure do these cadets carry as they step into a country in flux? You don't have to cross a border to make a geopolitical statement. Sometimes sharing a classroom is enough. This year's graduating class wasn't made up of Burkina cadets alone. More than 80 of the students came from Chad, commissioners and officers alike. That kind of cross-national enrollment isn't accidental, it's strategic. Burkina Faso didn't just open its academy to regional allies, it invited them. And that choice signals something deeper, a quiet pivot toward Pan-African alignment. In a time when alliances are shifting and old global partnerships feel more conditional than cooperative, this move seems to say we don't need permission. We need each other. It raises a question. If African states invest in training one another's forces, what kind of future could that build? We think this kind of collaboration doesn't just create operational strength. It creates shared identity, a shared investment in each other's survival. But that kind of closeness cuts both ways. If cooperation deepens, so does dependency. And when cadets are trained under the same roof with the same values and language, what happens if those nations later drift apart? Still, from the podium at the ceremony, the message was firm. This was not just a graduation, it was a demonstration of regional unity. One senior officer framed it this way: the borders drawn by colonizers have kept us divided for too long. We're erasing those lines not with conflict but with cooperation. That statement hit differently in the current climate. Before, military collaboration often came in the form of Western-led training initiatives or external consultants. Now, African states are trying to build something internal, homegrown, peer-led, and most importantly, accountable to no outside agenda. It's a proud shift, but it's also a high-stakes one. Because if this Pan-African model is to work, the integrity of every partner nation becomes a shared burden. One scandal, one breach, one collapse, and everyone's reputation feels the heat. So the stakes here aren't just symbolic, they're structural, and for these new officers, the pressure isn't just national anymore, it's regional. They won't just be judged for how they protect the streets of Ouagadougou or N'Djamena. They'll be measured by how they carry a continent's credibility forward. Which brings us to a more personal layer. What does that responsibility feel like when you're 24 years old, fresh out of training, and wearing a uniform that now stands for more than just your flag? Wearing the uniform is easy, carrying what it represents, that's the hard part. At the graduation, one speech stood out. It wasn't full of slogans, it was measured, clear, and aimed straight at the cadet's sense of self. They were told, "You're no longer just enforcers of law, you're the embodiment of national ethics." It's the kind of framing that reshapes how someone sees their job. Enforcement becomes service, service becomes example, and example, that's where the pressure lives. Before, a new officer's success might have been judged by arrests made, tasks completed, boxes checked. Now it's tied to how well they live out principles, loyalty, humility, discipline, even under fire. We think this reflects a broader trend, countries trying to move their forces beyond order and obedience toward integrity and trust. But that's easier said than done, especially when trust has been fragile for so long. One twist here is how ethics gets defined. Because when ethics are shaped by national vision, not by universal standards, they can shift subtly but meaningfully. What counts as right may change depending on the moment or the leadership. So the question becomes, how do young officers navigate that? If loyalty to the nation ever clashes with loyalty to the people, what wins? One officer said quietly, sometimes the uniform protects you, sometimes it isolates you. That's a tension many of us wouldn't feel day to day, but they do. And if you've ever wondered what it takes to lead while staying grounded, this is what it looks like in real time: trial, error, resolve. There's pride in this generation. You can see it in the way they stand, the way they talk about duty, about dignity. But pride alone won't carry them through. It's the quiet decisions, moment by moment, that will define whether this new model works. If stories like this help you see global security in a more human light, go ahead and follow. We unpack stories others skip over. Now, as we shift focus, it's worth asking, can these values survive outside ceremony when the real world pushes back? Security isn't just about who holds the weapons, it's about who decides when not to use them. In one of the most pointed moments of the ceremony, officers were reminded that the uniform comes with a moral weight. They were told to be close to the people, to collaborate with other forces, to serve not just with force but with ethics. That emphasis is important, and it's new. Because for decades, policing in this region has carried a reputation: detachment, rigidity, sometimes fear. The image of the officer was more enforcer than neighbor. Now that image is being redesigned. Cadets are being trained to think more like leaders than rule keepers. They're being asked to consider not just what they can do, but what they should do. We think that's a critical difference. Because if people could truly lead from a place of empathy and discipline at once, you might begin to bridge the gap between state and citizen. But that kind of leadership takes more than classroom hours. It takes experience, judgment, and a willingness to stand still when instinct says move. One speaker told the cadets, "The greatest strength you have is not in your arms, it's in your ethics." A line like that lands differently when you're 25, standing in formation, about to walk into a world that may not always play fair. So here's the question. Can a sense of moral clarity survive in the field where decisions are fast, emotions run high, and trust is fragile? Before this shift, officers were measured by compliance. Now they're being measured by judgment. And judgment doesn't come with a checklist, it comes with risk. We've seen this play out in other parts of the world. When you empower individual officers to think, to lead, you also open the door to divergence, to split-second decisions that reflect character more than protocol. That's what makes this moment in Burkina Faso so compelling. It's not just about reform, it's about redefining what power looks like: quiet, grounded, human. And as these cadets step into real-world challenges, the gap between what they've learned and what they'll face will test everything. You can teach someone how to lead a unit, but can you teach them how to carry doubt? The cadets were told, be firm, be loyal, be exemplary. But those traits are easier to define on paper than in the real world, especially in a nation navigating crisis, change, and constant outside pressure. That tension was clear in the speeches. There were calls for discipline, unity, courage, but layered underneath was something else, a kind of quiet realism. A recognition that the road ahead won't always reward those traits. This generation of officers has been groomed for leadership, but not the clean kind. Not the kind that fits easily into ceremony or doctrine. They're stepping into a world where leadership often means choosing between two imperfect options and owning the fallout either way. That's not theoretical, that's tomorrow. Before, officers might have leaned on protocol to shield them from complexity. Now they're being asked to stand in the gray, to stay calm when instructions aren't clear, to trust instinct but question impulse. We think that kind of emotional load doesn't get talked about enough, but it's real, especially for young officers trained under a national narrative that's bold, high stakes, and full of expectation. One line from the ceremony stood out more than the rest. The troop mirrors the leader, but the leader also reflects the troop. That idea flips the usual hierarchy. It suggests that power flows both ways, that respect must move down as much as it moves up. And if that's true, then the integrity of a unit depends on more than just its commander. It depends on how well people feel seen, heard, understood. It depends on whether leadership becomes something earned daily, not just granted by rank. That's a lot to carry at 26. But maybe if people could lead not just from above but from beside, the institutions they serve might grow stronger than the pressures they face. The cadets are stepping into a future no one can fully map, but they're not stepping in alone. Not every battle happens in the field. Some start the moment you put the uniform on. The final message to the cadets wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, and maybe because of that it landed harder, they were told. Your success won't come from command, it'll come from restraint. That feels like a contradiction until you live it. Because the hardest part of leadership isn't giving orders, it's holding the line when no one's watching. It's walking into a situation charged with fear or tension and choosing not to escalate even when you could. Before, success in security might have meant strength. Now it's starting to mean strategy. And strategy demands patience, empathy, clarity, not the kind you learn in drills, but the kind you earn in pressure. We think this evolution matters. If people could be trained not just in what to do, but in how to pause, how to ask questions before acting, maybe that's how trust gets built from the ground up. But that's a long game, and the weight of that work, it lives in small moments, in conversations, in choices that don't make headlines but shape the atmosphere of a city. One instructor described it like this: "You're no longer just securing buildings or borders, you're securing hope." That's poetic, sure, but it's also practical, because if citizens lose hope, even a strong state can't hold. This is what makes the Yantiali class different. They weren't just trained for a role, they were shaped for a purpose. And now that purpose gets tested every day in every interaction in ways no textbook can script. What we just watched wasn't just a ceremony, it was a signal, subtle but strong. The Yantiali class is stepping into roles that carry more than rank. They're walking into the weight of a vision, one that's political, historical, and deeply human. Their training is done, but the story is. This kind of content doesn't try to speak for a country, and it's not here to tell you who's right or wrong. It's a snapshot of how a nation presents itself at a particular moment in time. And I guess from my point of view that has value, because when we stop to look closely not just at the systems but at the people inside them, we start to see the bigger picture a little differently. I think that matters, especially now. If this story gave you a new perspective, or even just a new question, go ahead and hit subscribe. We dig into stories like this all the time, and not the ones trending, the ones that usually fly just under the radar. And hey, if you're curious about what's next, there's a news update coming that might just shift the way you've been looking at leadership in the region. Catch you there.